My sister spread rumors that I was crazy to steal my inheritance, so I had her committed using her own lies as evidence. When our grandmother died and left me her entire estate, I knew there'd be trouble. Grandma Rose had always favored me. I was the one who visited every week, who listened to her stories, who helped her with groceries when arthritis made simple tasks impossible. My sister Vivian showed up maybe twice a year, usually when she needed money. The will was crystal clear. The house, the investments, everything, $2.3 million total, came to me. Vivian got a small jewelry collection worth maybe 10 grand. At first, she tried the legal route, contested the will, claiming Grandma wasn't mentally competent. When that failed because I had 3 years of medical records proving Grandma's sharp mind, Vivian switched tactics. She started telling people I was losing it. It began subtly. At the grocery store, she'd mention to longtime family friends how worried she was about my episodes. At church, she'd whisper about finding me talking to myself in Grandma's empty house. She told our cousin I'd been making paranoid phone calls about people watching me. The stories grew more elaborate. I was supposedly hiding money in the walls, convinced the government was tracking my spending. She claimed I'd accused the mailman of stealing letters and had threatened to call the police on innocent neighbors. "I'm really concerned about her mental state," she'd say with fake tears. "The inheritance seems to have triggered something. Maybe the stress broke her." People started looking at me differently. Conversations would stop when I entered rooms. Old family friends began avoiding eye contact. Even my doctor seemed more cautious during appointments, asking probing questions about my mood and sleep patterns. The breaking point came when I overheard her on the phone with my uncle. "She's completely delusional now," Vivian said. "Yesterday, she told me Grandma's ghost was giving her investment advice. And last week, she called me at 3 a.m. rambling about hidden treasure in the attic. I think she needs professional help before she hurts herself or someone else." I recorded the entire conversation. That's when I realized what she was really doing. Vivian wasn't just trying to make me look crazy. She was building a case to have me declared mentally incompetent. If she could get me committed or assigned a guardian, she could challenge my control over the inheritance. But Vivian had made one crucial mistake. She'd been so convincing in her lies that people believed her completely. And if everyone thought I was dangerously unstable, well, those same stories could work in reverse. I started documenting everything. Every conversation where someone mentioned Vivian's concerns about me. Every time she repeated her fabricated stories. I recorded phone calls and saved text messages where she described my supposed breakdown in vivid detail. Then I did some research into involuntary commitment laws. 3 weeks later, I called 911 from Vivian's apartment, sobbing hysterically. "Please help," I begged. "My sister is having a complete psychotic break. She's been living in this delusional fantasy where she thinks our dead grandmother is haunting me. She's convinced I'm having conversations with ghosts and hiding money in walls. She called me 50 times yesterday, rambling about government conspiracies and threatened to hurt our mailman. I'm terrified she's going to hurt herself or someone else." When the paramedics arrived, I played them selected recordings of Vivian describing my supposed symptoms, edited carefully to remove context, making it sound like she was describing her own experiences. The responding officer took notes as I tearfully explained how Vivian had been exhibiting all these dangerous behaviors for weeks, how she'd been calling family members in the middle of the night with paranoid delusions, how she'd been making threats and seemed completely disconnected from reality. "She keeps insisting these things are happening to me," I said. "But I think she's projecting her own breakdown onto me because she can't handle our grandmother's death." I showed them text messages where Vivian described my symptoms in detail, now presented as evidence of her own deteriorating mental state. "Look at these messages," I said. "She's describing elaborate hallucinations and paranoid thoughts. She's texting me about people watching her, about hidden money, about ghost conversations. I've been trying to get her help, but she won't listen." The officer reviewed everything and agreed that Vivian showed clear signs of being a danger to herself and others. When they arrived at her apartment to conduct the welfare check, Vivian was furious. "This is insane," she screamed. "I never said any of those things about me. I said them about her. She's the one who's crazy." But the more she protested, the more unstable she sounded. When she tried to explain that she'd been spreading those stories about me, it only reinforced the narrative that she was confused and delusional. "Ma'am, we have recordings of you describing these symptoms in your own voice," the officer said patiently. "And we have documented evidence of you sending these concerning messages." "Those weren't about me," Vivian shrieked. "I was lying about her." The admission that she'd been fabricating mental health stories about a family member only made things worse. By this point, I was practically winning an Academy Award for my concerned sister performance. I wrung my hands and spoke to the officers in hushed, worried tones. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," I said. "She's becoming completely detached from reality. Now she's claiming she made up stories about me having mental health issues. But why would someone do that? It doesn't make any sense unless she's seriously unwell." The more Vivian tried to explain her scheme, the crazier she sounded. She ranted about inheritance laws and competency hearings while the officers exchanged glances. "She's obsessed with our grandmother's will," I explained sadly. "She can't accept that Grandma left everything to me. I think the grief and financial stress have pushed her over the edge." When Vivian screamed that I was manipulating everyone, that I'd stolen her inheritance, that she'd been systematically trying to discredit me, it sounded like textbook paranoid delusions. The clinician who arrived for the psychiatric evaluation found Vivian in a state of rage, making wild accusations about elaborate conspiracies. She claimed I'd recorded her private conversations and edited them to frame her. She insisted that multiple family members were in on a plot to steal her money. "Ma'am," the clinician said gently, "these recordings are in your own voice, describing concerning symptoms. Your sister is showing us text messages where you detail paranoid thoughts and threatening behavior." "I was lying," Vivian screamed. "I made all of that up about her." "So you're admitting to fabricating serious mental health accusations against a family member?" the clinician asked, making notes. Vivian realized her mistake too late. She tried to backtrack, to explain the context, but every word made her sound more unstable. I pulled the clinician aside privately. I need to tell you something, I whispered. There's a history of mental illness in our family. Our father had bipolar disorder and was hospitalized several times. I've been watching for signs in both of us since our grandmother died. This was actually true. Dad had struggled with mental health his entire life. He'd disappeared for weeks during manic episodes, convinced he was going to revolutionize the world with some impossible invention. During depressive phases, he'd lock himself in his room for days, refusing to eat or speak to anyone. Mom had spent years walking on eggshells, never knowing which version of him would walk through the door. I think the stress of the inheritance situation has triggered something in Vivian, I continued. She's been fixated on the idea that our grandmother's will was somehow unfair, even though Grandma was very clear about her wishes. She spent her entire childhood being jealous of the attention I got from Grandma, and I think losing out on the inheritance was the final straw. The clinician nodded sympathetically. Genetic predisposition combined with a major life stressor was a classic trigger for psychological breaks. When they asked Vivian about family mental health history, she confirmed that Dad had been bipolar, inadvertently supporting my narrative that she was having a hereditary breakdown. Yes, he was sick, she said desperately. But that doesn't mean I am. I was pretending she was crazy to get her money. This is all calculated revenge. To the medical professionals, this sounded like someone having delusions about elaborate conspiracies involving financial motives. The 72-hour hold was approved within an hour. As they led Vivian away in restraints, she looked back at me with pure hatred. This isn't over, she hissed. I'll prove what you did. I squeezed her hand gently. I just want you to get better, I said, loud enough for the officers to hear. I love you, and I'll be here when you're ready to come home. The next phase of my plan began immediately. I spent the days while Vivian was locked up visiting every person she'd lied to about me. I had to carefully rebuild my reputation while seeming genuinely concerned about my sister's breakdown. At the grocery store, I approached Mrs. Henley, the cashier who'd known our family for decades. I wanted to thank you for your concern about me, I said quietly. I know Vivian talked to you about some things, and I realize now that she was projecting her own struggles onto me. Mrs. Henley looked confused. Projecting? The doctors explained it to me, I said, fighting back fake tears. When people are having a psychological breakdown, they sometimes attribute their own symptoms to someone else. All those things she told you I was doing, talking to myself, being paranoid, making threats, those were actually warning signs of her own condition. Mrs. Henley's eyes widened. Oh my goodness, I had no idea. I feel terrible that I didn't recognize the signs sooner, I continued. She was clearly crying out for help, but I thought she was just being difficult about the inheritance. Word spread quickly through our small town. The same gossip network that Vivian had used to damage my reputation now worked in my favor. People began reinterpreting everything she'd told them through the lens of her supposed mental illness. The church ladies were particularly sympathetic. During Wednesday evening service, I stood up during prayer requests. Please pray for my sister Vivian, I said, voice trembling. She's been hospitalized for a psychiatric emergency. The doctors say she's been struggling with delusions and paranoid thoughts for months. I'm asking for prayers for her healing and for strength for our family during this difficult time. The congregation rallied around me. Mrs. Patterson, the pastor's wife, approached me after service. I feel so guilty, she whispered. Vivian told me she was worried about your mental state, but now I realize she was describing her own symptoms. How did we miss this? Mental illness is tricky, I said sadly. The doctor said it's common for people having a breakdown to project their experiences onto family members. Vivian probably didn't even realize she was doing it. At the post office, the mailman, elderly Walter Green, stopped me with a concerned expression. I heard about your sister, he said quietly. She came by last week asking weird questions about whether I'd noticed you acting strange. I thought it was odd at the time, but now it makes sense. What kind of questions? I asked. She wanted to know if you'd been accusing me of stealing mail, if you'd seemed paranoid when I delivered packages. I told her you'd always been perfectly normal, but she kept insisting I must have noticed something off about your behavior. I shook my head sadly. The doctors think she was trying to find evidence to support her own delusions. She's been convinced for weeks that someone was watching her, tracking her movements. I guess she thought if she could get others to say they'd seen similar behavior in me, it would validate her paranoia. Walter looked genuinely distressed. Poor girl. I've known her since she was little. This must be so hard on your family. At home, I began documenting everything for the inevitable legal battles to come. I created a timeline of Vivian's deteriorating behavior, using her own lies against her. Every story she'd told about me became evidence of her growing instability. I found the notebook where she'd written down details about my supposed symptoms. In her handwriting, she'd recorded elaborate paranoid scenarios, threatening behaviors, and delusional thinking patterns. She'd intended to use these notes to build a case against me, but now they served as a diary of her own mental decline. I photographed every page, making sure to capture the dates she'd written beside each entry. To anyone reviewing the evidence, it would look like Vivian had been documenting her own psychological deterioration for months. The entries were detailed and damning. March 15th, called me at 2 a.m. asking if I'd seen cars parked outside her house. Claims government is monitoring her spending habits. March 22nd, found her in Grandma's attic, digging through old boxes looking for hidden money. When I asked what she was doing, she said Grandma's spirit told her there was treasure up there. March 28th, threatened to call police on mailman, convinced he's stealing her letters. Accused him of being part of surveillance operation. Each entry painted a picture of escalating paranoia and detachment from reality. The fact that they were written in Vivian's own hand made them incredibly powerful evidence. I also reviewed all the text messages she'd sent me over the past few months. Many of them contained elaborate descriptions of my supposed symptoms, which could now be reframed as her projecting her own experiences onto me. One particularly useful message read, "I'm really worried about you. You keep talking about hearing voices and seeing things that aren't there. Last night you called me crying about people following you. This isn't normal behavior." In context, it would now appear that Vivian had been experiencing auditory hallucinations and paranoid delusions about being followed, but was attributing these symptoms to me instead of recognizing them in herself. The psychiatric facility was actually quite nice. Private rooms, counseling sessions, art therapy. I visited every day playing the devoted sister perfectly. I brought flowers and magazines, spoke to her doctors about my concerns, and asked detailed questions about her treatment plan. Has she mentioned the inheritance at all? I asked Dr. Morrison during our first family meeting. I'm worried that financial stress might have contributed to her breakdown. Dr. Morrison glanced at his notes. She has expressed some concerning beliefs about money and family conflicts. She seems to believe that you've somehow orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy involving multiple people to steal money from her. I nodded sadly. That's exactly what I was afraid of. She's been fixated on our grandmother's will ever since the reading. She couldn't understand why Grandma left everything to me, and I think the grief combined with financial disappointment pushed her over the edge. Can you tell me more about your grandmother's relationship with each of you? Dr. Morrison asked. I chose my words carefully. Grandma always tried to be fair, but I think I had a closer relationship with her in her final years. I visited regularly, helped with errands, spent holidays with her. Vivian was busy with her own life, which is completely normal for someone her age. But I think she started to resent the time I spent with Grandma, especially when she realized it might affect the inheritance. And how did Vivian react when the will was read? She was shocked, I said. She immediately hired a lawyer to contest it, claiming Grandma wasn't mentally competent. When that failed, she became obsessed with proving that I'd somehow manipulated the situation. She started telling people I was having mental health issues, that the stress of the inheritance had made me unstable. Dr. Morrison made notes. And you believe she was projecting her own psychological state onto you? The timeline matches perfectly, I said. Right around the time she started claiming I was having paranoid thoughts and delusional episodes, I noticed she was becoming increasingly agitated and suspicious. She'd call me at all hours with strange theories about people watching her or following her. She became convinced that various family members were conspiring against her. Vivian's protest that she was completely sane only reinforced her diagnosis. The more she insisted that I'd orchestrated everything, the more the staff saw evidence of paranoid delusions. She's fixated on conspiracy theories. Dr. Morrison told me during another family meeting. She believes you've somehow manipulated medical professionals, law enforcement, and family members in an elaborate scheme. This level of paranoid thinking suggests a significant break from reality. I wiped away a tear. Is there anything I can do to help? I feel terrible that I didn't see the signs earlier. The best thing you can do is be patient, the doctor said. Recovery from this type of psychotic episode takes time. She may continue to blame you for her hospitalization as part of her delusional thinking. During visiting hours, I'd sit beside Vivian's bed and speak in gentle, concerned tones. I know you're angry with me, I'd say. But I only called for help because I was scared you might hurt yourself. I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you. Vivian would stare at me with undisguised fury, but she'd learned to control her outbursts. The staff had made it clear that aggressive behavior would extend her stay. You won't get away with this, she'd whisper when no one was listening. I don't know what you mean, I'd reply innocently. I just want you to get well. Sometimes I'd bring photo albums from our childhood, flipping through pictures while she sat in stony silence. Remember this? I'd say, pointing to a picture of us at Christmas morning. Grandma always made sure we each got the same number of presents. She loved us both so much. Vivian's jaw would clench, but she couldn't respond without seeming delusional. After all, how could she explain that Grandma had clearly favored me without sounding bitter and paranoid? I miss her too, I'd continue softly. I think losing her was harder on both of us than we realized. Grief affects people differently. The medical staff noted my dedication in their reports. I was clearly a loving sister, providing constant support despite Vivian's hostility and accusations. One afternoon, I brought Vivian's favorite coffee from the local cafe. As I set it on her bedside table, she grabbed my wrist. Why are you doing this? She whispered urgently. You've already won. You have everything. Why do you need to destroy me too? I gently extracted my wrist from her grip. I'm not trying to destroy you. I'm trying to help you get better. Cut the act, she hissed. There's no one else here. Just tell me why. I looked directly into her eyes. Because you tried to take away the only thing I had left of Grandma. You were willing to have me declared insane just to get money you didn't deserve. You started a war, and I finished it. Vivian's face crumpled. I was desperate. I have nothing. No savings, no career, no prospects. I thought Grandma would leave us equal shares. Grandma left her money to the person who earned it, I said quietly. If you'd spent half as much time caring about her as you did counting her assets, maybe things would have been different. So this is my punishment? She asked. This is a consequence, I corrected. Actions have consequences. You chose to lie about me, to try to manipulate everyone into believing I was mentally ill. Now you're living with the results of that choice. Vivian stared at me for a long moment. You're scarier than I ever was. No, I said, standing to leave. I'm smarter than you ever were. 3 weeks into her stay, Vivian's lawyer came to visit. Robert Fitzgerald had been her attorney for years, handling her divorce and business contracts. She tried to explain the whole situation, how she'd been spreading rumors about my mental health, how I'd turned her own lies against her, how the inheritance was the real motive. But by then, she had an official psychiatric diagnosis on her medical record. Her claims sounded like the desperate ravings of someone who couldn't accept responsibility for her own breakdown. Vivian, Robert said carefully. Even if everything you're saying is true, you've admitted to deliberately spreading false information about your sister's mental health. That's defamation at minimum, and potentially criminal harassment. It's not going to look good in any legal proceeding. Vivian grabbed his arm. But don't you see? She used my own plan against me. She recorded me making up those stories about her, then edited the recordings to make it sound like I was talking about myself. Robert glanced around the sterile hospital room, taking in the security cameras and medical equipment. The recordings would need to be authenticated by experts, he said. That's expensive and time-consuming. And even if we could prove they were edited, you'd still have to admit that you originally fabricated mental health symptoms about your sister in an attempt to steal her inheritance. Vivian's face crumpled. So what am I supposed to do? Focus on getting well, Robert said gently. The inheritance case is over. Your sister has clear legal ownership of your grandmother's estate, and your recent situation makes any competency challenge impossible. What about my reputation? Vivian asked desperately. Everyone in town thinks I'm crazy now. Robert sighed. That ship has sailed. The best thing you can do is complete your treatment, stay on whatever medication they prescribe, and consider starting fresh somewhere new. After Robert left, Vivian sat by her window for hours, staring out at the parking lot. I watched from the doorway, genuinely feeling sorry for her. She'd trapped herself perfectly, but my sympathy only went so far. She'd started this war. The real test came when Dad visited. He'd driven down from his retirement community in Florida, looking confused and worried. Dad had always been fragile since his own struggles with mental illness, and seeing Vivian in a psychiatric ward was clearly triggering for him. I don't understand, he said during our family meeting with Dr. Morrison. Vivian seemed fine at Christmas, a little stressed about money, but fine. I took his hand gently. The doctors say that sometimes mental illness can be hidden for months before it manifests openly. All those concerns she expressed about my behavior, she was actually describing her own symptoms. Dad nodded slowly. I remember when I was sick, I thought everyone else was the problem. I couldn't see that I was the one acting strangely. Dr. Morrison made notes. Having a father confirm the family history of mental illness and validate the pattern of projection made Vivian's case even more hopeless. Will she get better? Dad asked. With proper medication and therapy, most patients with her condition can learn to manage their symptoms, Dr. Morrison said. But it's a chronic illness that requires ongoing treatment. Vivian's eyes filled with tears as she listened to them discuss her future like she wasn't even there. Can I talk to her alone? Dad asked. Dr. Morrison nodded and left us in the room. Dad pulled his chair close to Vivian's bed. Sweetheart, he said gently. I know this is scary. When I was hospitalized, I felt like everyone was against me too. But the medication helped. The therapy helped. You can get through this. Vivian looked at me desperately, then back at Dad. I'm not sick like you were. This is all a misunderstanding. Dad patted her hand. That's what I said too. Denial is part of the illness, but your sister called for help because she loves you. Just like Mom called for help when I was sick. The parallel was perfect. Dad's validation of my story, combined with his firsthand experience with mental illness, made it impossible for Vivian to convince him that she was the victim of a conspiracy. After Dad left, I stayed behind to talk with Vivian privately. You could end this, I said quietly. Accept that Grandma's will was legal and fair. Stop fighting me on the inheritance. Focus on rebuilding your life. Vivian's voice was hoarse from crying. I can't afford to start over. I invested everything I had in that legal challenge. I'm broke. I pretended to consider this. What if I helped you? A small monthly allowance from the estate. Enough to get you back on your feet. Hope flickered in her eyes. You'd do that? On one condition, I said. No more legal challenges. No more trying to prove I manipulated you. Accept that you had a breakdown and move forward. Vivian stared at me for a long moment. She knew I was offering her a way out. Financial security in exchange for admitting defeat. How much? She whispered. $5,000 a month, I said. For 5 years. That's $300,000 total. More than enough to start fresh somewhere new. It was a generous offer. And we both knew it. Vivian could disappear, build a new life, and pretend none of this ever happened. What's the catch? She asked. Sign a document admitting that you fabricated stories about my mental health in an attempt to contest the will. Acknowledge that your hospitalization was necessary due to your own psychological breakdown. Agree never to contact anyone from our hometown again. Vivian closed her eyes. You want me to confess publicly that I'm the crazy one. I want you to tell the truth, I said. The choice is yours. Take the money and disappear. Or stay here and keep fighting a battle you can't win. She was quiet for so long I thought she'd fallen asleep. Finally, she whispered, I'll think about it. The next day, Vivian's attitude had completely changed. She was cooperative with the medical staff, participated in group therapy, and even smiled when I visited. I've been thinking about what you said, she told me. Maybe you're right. Maybe I did have some kind of breakdown. All that stress about the inheritance, losing Grandma, feeling like nobody cared about me, it probably affected my judgment. Dr. Morrison was pleased with her progress. It's a positive sign when patients can acknowledge their condition and accept responsibility for their actions, he told me privately. But I knew Vivian better than that. She was playing along, trying to get release so she could regroup and attack from a different angle. I wasn't going to give her that chance. During my next visit, I brought a manila folder containing the confession document I'd drafted. I had my lawyer draw this up, I said, sliding it across the table. If you sign it, I'll have the first payment deposited in your account before you're discharged. Vivian read through the document carefully. It was brutal. A complete admission of guilt that would make any future legal action impossible. This is humiliating, she said. This is realistic, I corrected. You tried to destroy me and failed. Now you can either accept the consequences gracefully or keep fighting and lose everything. The document was comprehensive, covering every aspect of her campaign against me. I, Vivian Catherine Whitfield, hereby acknowledge and confess that I deliberately and systematically spread false information about my sister's mental health and emotional stability. I fabricated stories about paranoid behavior, delusional thinking, and threatening actions that never occurred. My motivation was financial. I was attempting to have my sister declared mentally incompetent so that I could challenge her legal inheritance of our grandmother's estate. I further acknowledge that my own hospitalization for psychiatric evaluation was necessary and appropriate. The symptoms I attributed to my sister, including paranoid thoughts, conspiracy theories, and aggressive behavior, were actually manifestations of my own deteriorating mental health, brought on by grief, financial stress, and resentment over the inheritance. I understand that my actions constitute defamation of character and attempted fraud. I agree to make no further legal challenges to the will of Rose Elizabeth Whitfield, and I waive any claims to additional inheritance beyond what was specifically bequeathed to me. In exchange for financial assistance from my sister, I agree to relocate away from our hometown and to have no contact with family, friends, community members, or anyone else to whom I previously made false statements about my sister's mental health. I sign this document freely and without coercion, acknowledging that it represents the truth about my actions and their consequences. Vivian stared at the paper for a long time. If I sign this, and you ever stop the payments, then you'll be exactly where you are right now, I said, except you'll have had 5 years to build a new life somewhere else. She signed it. The confession was everything I needed to protect myself permanently. In her own handwriting, Vivian had admitted to every single thing she'd done, plus acknowledged that her own mental health crisis was real and justified. I had the document notarized and filed copies with my attorney, my bank, and a safe deposit box. Vivian was discharged 2 days later with a prescription for antipsychotic medication and a referral for ongoing therapy. True to my word, I deposited $5,000 in her account and helped her pack her belongings. She decided to move to Oregon, where she had a distant cousin who'd offered her a place to stay. As I drove her to the airport, we barely spoke. At the departure gate, she turned to me one last time. "I know what you did," she said quietly. "I know what you tried to do," I replied. "The difference is that I succeeded." She disappeared into the crowd of passengers, and I haven't seen her since. But my work wasn't done yet. Over the next few months, I systematically rebuilt my reputation in our hometown. I joined committees at church, volunteered for charity events, and became active in community organizations. People saw me as the devoted sister who'd sacrificed to help Vivian through her crisis. I used Vivian's signed confession strategically. When anyone asked about her, I'd mention sadly that she'd admitted to making up stories about me during her breakdown. "She's getting help now," I'd say. The doctors think the stress of losing Grandma triggered something she'd been suppressing for years. The confession document also served as insurance. If Vivian ever tried to return and contest the inheritance again, I had written proof of her admission of guilt. I donated a substantial amount to the local mental health clinic and had a wing named in Grandma's honor. The dedication ceremony was covered by the newspaper, with photos of me cutting the ribbon. "My grandmother always believed in taking care of people who couldn't take care of themselves," I said in my speech. "I know she would be proud to have her name associated with such important work." The article mentioned that the donation was made possible by Rose Whitfield's generous bequest to her granddaughter and included a sidebar about the importance of mental health awareness and family support. The reporter, a young woman named Jennifer Hayes, interviewed me afterward. "It must have been difficult, dealing with your sister's breakdown while managing such a large inheritance," she said. I nodded sadly. The timing was especially hard because Vivian was so stressed about our grandmother's will. She couldn't understand why she'd been left a smaller inheritance, and I think that disappointment, combined with grief, really affected her mental health. "How is she doing now?" "She's getting excellent care," I said. "She's moved to a quieter environment where she can focus on her recovery. The doctors are optimistic about her progress." Jennifer made notes. "And you're continuing to support her?" "Of course," I said. "She's my sister." Mental illness doesn't change the fact that family has to stick together. The article painted me in an incredibly sympathetic light. The grieving granddaughter who'd inherited a fortune, then used part of it to help her troubled sister and support mental health causes. 6 months after Vivian left, I received a letter from Oregon. She'd found work as a bookkeeper for a small business and was renting a studio apartment near the coast. The letter was carefully cheerful, mentioning how much she enjoyed the ocean views and her therapy sessions. She never asked for news about home. The monthly payments continued like clockwork, $5,000 deposited in her account on the first of every month. She never called to thank me or ask questions. We both understood the arrangement. I began using part of the inheritance to make improvements to Grandma's house. I renovated the kitchen she'd always wanted to update, installed central air conditioning, and restored the garden that had been her pride and joy. The house became a showpiece in our neighborhood. I hosted charity events in the garden using Grandma's fine china and crystal. The local historical society asked if they could include it in their annual home tour. "Your grandmother would be so proud," Mrs. Patterson told me during one of the garden parties. "You've honored her memory beautifully." I smiled, thinking about how Grandma had worried that Vivian would sell the house and spend the money carelessly. Instead, it had become a gathering place for the community she'd loved. 18 months later, I got a wedding invitation. Vivian had met someone, a divorced accountant named Marcus who owned a small tax preparation business. The ceremony would be small, just immediate family. I wasn't invited to attend. I sent a generous wedding gift anyway, a crystal vase that Grandma would have approved of. The card read, "Wishing you happiness in your new life. Love, your sister." Vivian sent a brief thank you note. Her handwriting looked steadier than I'd seen it in years. 3 years into our arrangement, something unexpected happened. I met someone too. James Dalton was a financial advisor who helped me reorganize Grandma's investment portfolio. He was patient, funny, and completely uninterested in my money. During our professional meetings, he'd tell stories about his ridiculous clients or share pictures of his dog, a golden retriever named Buster who was obsessed with tennis balls. When he asked me to dinner, I almost said no. Dating felt complicated when you were sitting on a multi-million-dollar inheritance. But James made me laugh in a way I hadn't in years. On our third date, I told him about Vivian, a carefully edited version where she'd had a mental breakdown over the inheritance, and I was supporting her recovery. That's incredibly generous, he said. Not many people would help a sibling who'd caused them so much pain. I shrugged. Family is complicated. What I didn't tell him was how satisfying it felt to have won so completely. Every month when I transferred that money to Vivian's account, I remembered how she'd tried to destroy me. Now she was dependent on my charity for her basic survival. James and I were married 2 years later in Grandma's garden. It was a small ceremony. I'd grown tired of performing for the town gossips. Dad walked me down the aisle, beaming with pride. He'd recovered remarkably well from his own mental health struggles and was genuinely happy to see me settled. "Your grandmother is watching," he whispered as he handed me over to James. "She'd be so proud of the woman you've become." For our honeymoon, we traveled to Italy, staying in the same hotels Grandma had always dreamed of visiting. I brought her ashes with me and scattered them in the Mediterranean, fulfilling a promise I'd made at her bedside. James understood the significance of the gesture. He held my hand as I said goodbye to the woman who'd shaped my entire life. "She gave you more than money," he said quietly. "She gave you strength." The 5th year of payments to Vivian approached quickly. According to our agreement, the money would stop after 60 months. I wondered if she'd contact me when the payments ended, maybe try to negotiate an extension. But the deadline came and went without a word from Oregon. A year later, I received a birth announcement. Vivian and Marcus had a daughter, Clara Rose, named after our grandmother. The photo showed a chubby baby with Vivian's dark eyes and serious expression. On the back, Vivian had written, "Thank you for giving me the chance to start over." It was the closest thing to gratitude I'd ever received from her. I framed the photo and put it on the mantle in Grandma's old house, next to pictures of James and me. Sometimes visitors would ask about the baby, and I'd explain that she was my niece, born to my sister who lived in Oregon. "We don't see each other often," I'd say, "but family is important." 5 more years passed. James and I had children of our own, twin boys named Thomas and William who filled Grandma's house with the kind of chaos she would have loved. We converted her old sewing room into a nursery and installed a swing set in the backyard where she used to grow roses. The boys knew they had an Aunt Vivian somewhere, but she was more of a distant concept than a real person. I'd show them her Christmas cards and explain that she lived far away. "Why doesn't she visit?" Thomas asked one day, examining a photo of Clara that Vivian had included in her card. "Sometimes families live in different places," I explained, "but that doesn't mean we don't love each other." William, always the more thoughtful twin, frowned. "Did you have a fight?" James looked up from his newspaper, curious about how I'd handle the question. "We had some disagreements when we were younger," I said carefully, "but now we both have our own families to focus on." It was technically true, if incomplete. Then, unexpectedly, Vivian called. It was a Tuesday evening in October. James was reading bedtime stories to the twins when my phone rang with an Oregon number I didn't recognize. "It's me," Vivian said when I answered. Her voice was different, softer, more confident than I remembered. "How are you?" I asked carefully. "I'm good. Really good, actually." She paused. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For forcing me to leave. For making me start over. I hated you for years, but you were right. I was obsessed with that money. It was making me crazy." I sat down in Grandma's old rocking chair, unsure how to respond. "I have a real life now," Vivian continued. "Marcus is a good man. Clara is incredible. I run the books for 3 small businesses, and we just bought a house. I'm happy in a way I never was when I was fighting you." "I'm glad to hear that," I said, and I meant it. "I know you probably think I'm calling to ask for more money," she said, "but I'm not. I just wanted you to know that whatever happened between us, it worked out the way it was supposed to." We talked for another 10 minutes about her daughter, her husband, her quiet life by the ocean. She asked about the twins and James, making appropriate ant-like noises about how big they must be getting. "Maybe someday," she said before hanging up. "When enough time has passed, we could try to be sisters again." I didn't commit to anything, but I didn't say no either. When I hung up, James looked at me curiously. "How was that?" he asked. "Strange," I admitted. "She sounded healthy, happy even. Maybe she really has changed." I nodded, but part of me remained skeptical. Vivian had always been good at reinventing herself when it served her purposes. Still, the phone call left me thoughtful. I'd won our war so completely that Vivian had been forced to become a different person entirely. Whether that was justice or simply the natural consequence of her own actions, I wasn't sure. Over the following weeks, I found myself thinking about Clara, the niece I'd never met. She was 8 now, old enough to ask questions about her family. Did she know she had an aunt and twin cousins? Did Vivian tell her stories about growing up with me? Part of me was curious about the life Vivian had built in Oregon, but a larger part of me was satisfied with the distance between us. Some bridges, once burned, were better left as ashes. The inheritance continued to grow under James's careful management. We lived comfortably but not extravagantly, saving most of it for the twins' education and future. I'd also established a trust for charitable giving, focusing on mental health services and elder care, causes that would have mattered to Grandma. On quiet evenings, I'd sit in her old chair and think about the choices that had led us all to this point. Vivian had tried to destroy me out of greed and jealousy. I'd defended myself using her own weapons against her. She'd lost everything and been forced to rebuild from nothing. In the end, we'd both gotten exactly what we deserved. Sometimes the boys would ask about the big family portrait in the living room, the last photo taken before Grandma died, showing all of us together at Christmas. "That's your Aunt Vivian," I'd tell them, pointing to her smiling face. "She lives far away now, but she was part of our family once." "Will we ever meet her?" William would ask. "Maybe someday," I'd say, "when you're older." But privately, I hoped that day would never come. The past was better left buried, and some family stories were too complicated for children to understand. Vivian had taught me that blood relationships meant nothing without respect and loyalty. She'd been willing to destroy me for money that was never rightfully hers. I'd simply been better at the game she'd chosen to play. And in the end, that was enough.